This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. A leaked top-secret order has revealed the Obama administration is conducting a massive domestic surveillance program by collecting telephone records of millions of Verizon business customers. Last night, the Guardian newspaper published a classified order issued by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court directing Verizon's business network services to give the National Security Agency electronic data, including all calling records on a, quote, ongoing daily basis. The order covers each phone number dialed by all customers, along with location and routing data, and with the duration and frequency of the calls, but not the contents of the communications. The order expressly compels Verizon to turn over records for both international and domestic records. It also forbids Verizon from disclosing the existence of the court order. It is unclear if other phone companies were ordered to hand over similar information.
According to legal analysts, the Obama administration relied on a controversial provision in the USA Patriot Act, Section 215, that authorizes the government to seek secret court orders for the production of, quote, any tangible thing relevant to a foreign intelligence or terrorism investigation. The disclosure comes just weeks after news broke that the Obama administration had been spying on journalists from the Associated Press and James Rosen, a reporter from Fox News. We're now joined by two former employees of the National Security Agency, Thomas Drake and William Binney. In 2010, the Obama administration charged Drake with violating the Espionage Act after he was accused of leaking classified information to the press about waste and mismanagement at the agency. The charges were later dropped. William Binney worked for almost 40 years at the NSA. He resigned shortly after the September 11th attacks over his concern over the increasing surveillance of Americans. We're also joined in studio here by Shana Karidal, senior managing attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights. First, for your legal opinion, Shana, can you talk about the significance of what has just been revealed?
Sure. So I think, we have had stories, including one in USA Today in May 2006, that have said that the government is collecting, basically all the phone records from a number of large telephone companies. What's significant about yesterday's disclosure is that it's the first time that we've seen the order to really appreciate the sort of staggeringly broad scope of what one of the judges on this Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court approved of, and the first time that we can now confirm that this was under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which, has been dubbed the libraries provision because people were mostly worried about the idea that the government would use it to get library records. Now we know that they're using it to get phone records. And just to see the immense scope of this warrant order, when most warrants are very narrow, is really shocking as a lawyer.
Well, some might argue that the Obama administration at least went to the FISA court to get approval for this, unlike the Bush administration in the past.
Right. Well, we don't know if the Bush administration was, getting these same orders, and if this is just a continuation, a renewal order. Right? It lasted for only, it's supposed to last for only 3 months, but they may have been getting one every 3 months since 2006 or even earlier. When Congress reapproved this authority in 2011, one of the things Congress thought was, well, at least they'll have to present these things to a judge and get some judicial review, and Congress will get some reporting of the total number of orders. But when one order covers every single phone record for a massive phone company like Verizon, the reporting that gets to Congress is going to be very hollow. And then similarly, when the judges on the FISA court are handpicked by the Chief Justice, and the government can go to a judge, as they did here in North Florida, who was appointed by Ronald Reagan, who's 73 years old and is known as a draconian kind of hanging judge in his sentencing, and get some order that's this broad, I think both the judicial review and the congressional oversight checks are very weak.
And of course, this is just Verizon because that's what Glenn Greenwald of The Guardian got a hold of. That doesn't mean that there aren't other orders for the other telephone companies,
Absolutely.
Right? Like Bell South, like AT&T, et cetera,
right.
as there have been in the past.
Yeah, those were companies mentioned in that USA Today story in 2006. Nothing about the breadth of this order indicates that it's tied to any particular national security investigation, as the statute says it has to be. So some commentators yesterday said, well, this order came out on, it's dated 10 days after the Boston attacks, but it's forward-looking. It goes forward for 3 months. Why would anyone need to get every record from Verizon Business in order to investigate the Boston bombings after they happened?
And William Binney, a decades-long veteran of the NSA, your reaction when you heard about this news?
Well, this was just the FBI going after data. That was their request. And they're doing that because if they want to try to get it, they have to have it approved by a court in order to get it as evidence into a courtroom. But NSA has been doing all this stuff all along, and it's been all the companies, not just one. And I basically looked at that and said, well, if Verizon got one, so did everybody else, which means that, you know, they're just continuing the collection of this kind of information on all U.S. citizens. That's one of the main reasons they couldn't tell Senator Wyden with his request of how many U.S. citizens are in the NSA databases. There's just, in my estimate, it was, if you collapse it down to all uniques, it's a little over 280 million U.S. citizens are in there, each in there several hundred to several thousand times.
In fact, let's go to Senator Wyden. The secret court order to obtain the Verizon phone records was sought by the FBI under a section of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that was expanded by the Patriot Act. In 2011, Democratic Senator Ron Wyden warned about how the government was interpreting its surveillance powers under Section 215 of the Patriot Act.
When the American people find out how their government has secretly interpreted the Patriot Act, they are going to be stunned, and they are going to be angry. And they're going to ask senators, did you know what this law actually permits? Why didn't you know before you voted on it? The fact is, anyone can read the plain text of the Patriot Act, and yet many members of Congress have no idea how the law is being secretly interpreted by the executive branch because that interpretation is classified. It's almost as if there were two Patriot Acts, and many members of Congress have not read the one that matters. Our constituents, of course, are totally in the dark. Members of the public have no access to the secret legal interpretations, so they have no idea what their government believes the law actually means.
That's Senator Ron Wyden. He and Senator Udall have been raising concerns because they sit on the Senate Intelligence Committee, but cannot speak out openly exactly about what they know. William Binney, you left the agency after September 2001, deeply concerned. This is after you've been there for 40 years, about the amount of surveillance of U.S. citizens. In the end, your house was raided. You were in the shower. You're a diabetic amputee. The authorities had a gun at your head. Which agency had the gun at your head, by the way?
That was the FBI.
You were not charged, though you were terrorized. Can you link that to what we're seeing today?
Well, it's directly linked because it has to do with all of the surveillance of the U.S. citizens that's been going on since 9/11. I mean, they were getting, from just one company alone that I knew of, they were getting over 300 million call records a day on U.S. citizens. So, I mean, and when you add the rest of the companies in, my estimate was that there were probably 3 billion phone records collected every day on U.S. citizens. So over time, that's a little over 12 trillion in their databases since 9/11. And that's just phones. That doesn't count the emails. Then they're avoiding talking about emails there because that's also collecting content of what people are saying. And that's in the databases that NSA has and that the FBI taps into. It also tells you how closely they're related. When the FBI asks for data and the court approves it, the data is sent to NSA because they've got all the algorithms to do the diagnostics and community reconstructions and things like that, so that the FBI can makes it easier for the FBI to interpret what's in there.
We're also joined by Thomas Drake, who was prosecuted by the Obama administration after he blew the whistle on mismanagement and waste and constitutional violations at the NSA. Thomas Drake, your reaction to this latest revelation?
My reaction, where's the mainstream media been? This is routine. These are routine orders. This is nothing new. What's new is we're actually seeing an actual order, and people are somehow surprised by it. The fact remains that this program has been in place for quite some time. It was actually started shortly after 9/11. The Patriot Act was the enabling mechanism that allowed the United States government in secret to acquire subscriber records from any company that exists in the United States. I think what people are now realizing is that this isn't just a terrorist issue. This is simply the ability of the government in secret on a vast scale to collect any and all phone call records, including domestic to domestic, local as well as location information. There's no need now to call this the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Let's just call it the Surveillance Court. It's no longer about foreign intelligence. It's simply about harvesting millions and millions and millions of phone call records and beyond. And this is only just Verizon. As large as Verizon is, with upwards of 100 million subscribers, what about all the other telecoms? What about all the other internet service providers? It's become institutionalized in this country in the greatest of secrecy for the government to classify, conceal not only the facts of the surveillance, but also the secret laws that are supporting surveillance.
Thomas Drake, what can they do with this information, what's called metadata? I mean, they don't have the content of the conversation, supposedly, or maybe we just don't see that. That's under another request. Because remember, we are just seeing this one for people who are listening and watching right now, this one request that is specifically to, and I also want to ask you, it's Verizon Business Services. Does that have any significance? But what does it mean to have the length of time and not the names of, but where the call originates and where it is going, the phone numbers back and forth?
You get incredible amounts of information about subscribers. It's basically the ability to forward profile as well as look backwards all activities associated with those phone numbers. And not only just the phone numbers and who you called and who called you, but also the community of interest beyond that. Who are they were calling? I mean, we're talking about a phenomenal set of records that is continually being added to, aggregated year after year after year on what have now become routine orders. Now, you add the location information, that's a tracking mechanism, monitoring tracking of all phone calls that are being made by individuals. I mean, this is an extraordinary breach. I've said this for years. Our representing attorney, Justin Radak from the Government Accountability Project, we've been saying this for years, and from the wilderness. You've had us on your show in the past. But it's like, hey, everybody kind of went to sleep, while the government is harvesting all these records on a routine basis. You got to remember, none of this is probable cause. This is simply the ability to collect. And as I was told shortly after 9/11, you don't understand, Mr. Drake. We just want the data. And so the secret surveillance regime really has a hoarding complex, and they can't get enough of it. And so here we're faced with the reality that a government in secret, an abject violation of the Fourth Amendment under the cover of Enabling Act legislation for the past 12 years, is routinely analyzing what is supposed to be private information. But hey, it doesn't matter anymore, right? Because we can get to it. We have secret agreements with the telecoms and internet service providers and beyond, and we can do with the data anything we want. So, I sit here as an American, as I did shortly after 9/11, and it's all deja vu for me. And then I was targeted. It's important to note, not just for massive fraud, waste, and abuse, I was specifically targeted as the source for the New York Times article that came out in December of 2005. They actually thought that I was the secret source regarding the secret surveillance program. Ultimately, I was charged under the Espionage Act. So that should tell you something. Sends an extraordinarily chilling message. It is probably the deepest, darkest secret of both administrations, greatly expanded under the Obama administration. It's now routine practice.
Shana, I'd like to ask you specifically that issue of the FISA court also authorizing domestic surveillance. I mean, is there, even with the little laws that we have left, is there any a chance that for that to be challenged, that the FISA court is now also authorizing domestic records being surveilled?
FISA being Foreign Intelligence Surveillance.
Right. I mean, two things about that. First, the statute says that there have to be reasonable grounds to think that this information is relevant to an investigation of either foreign terrorist activity or something to do with the foreign power. So, obviously this perhaps very compliant judge approved this order, but it doesn't seem like this is what Congress intended these orders would look like. It seems like on the statute that Congress intended they would be somewhat narrower than this, right? But there's a larger question, which is that for years the Supreme Court, since 1979, has said we don't have the same level of protection over, the calling records, the numbers that we dial and how long those calls are and when they happen, as we do over the contents of a phone call where the government needs a warrant. So everyone assumes the government needs a warrant to get at your phone records and maybe at your emails, but it's not true. They just basically need a subpoena under existing doctrine. And so the government uses these kind of subpoenas to get your email records, your web surfing records, cloud documents in cloud storage, banking records, credit records. For all these things, they can get these extraordinarily broad subpoenas that don't even need to go through a court.
Shana, talk about the significance of President Obama nominating James Comey to be the head of the FBI and who he was.
Right. One of the grand ironies is that Obama has nominated a Republican who served in the Bush administration for a long time, a guy with a reputation as being kind of personally incorruptible. I think in part he nominated him to be the head of the FBI, the person who would, be responsible for seeking and renewing these kind of orders in the future for the next 10 years. He named Comey a Republican because he wanted to, I think, distract from the phone records scandal, the fact that Holder's Justice Department has gone after the phone records of the Associated Press and of Fox News reporter James Rosen, right? And you asked, what can you tell from these numbers? Well, if you see the reporter called, 5 or 6 of his favorite sources and then wrote a particular report that divulged some, embarrassing government secret, that's just as good as hearing what the reporter was saying over the phone line. And so we had this huge, scandal over the fact that the government went after the phone records of AP, when now we know they're going after everyone's phone records. And I think one of the grand ironies is that, he named Comey because he had this reputation as being kind of a stand-up guy who stood up to Bush in John Ashcroft's hospital room in 2004 and famously, said we have to cut back on what the NSA is doing. But what the NSA was doing was probably much broader than what the New York Times finally divulged in that story in December '05.
Very quickly, will Glenn Greenwald now be investigated of The Guardian, who got the copy of this so that they can find his leak, not to mention possibly prosecute him?
Oh, I think absolutely there'll be some sort of effort to go after him punitively. The government rarely tries to prosecute people who are recognized as journalists, and so Julian Assange maybe is someone they try to portray as not a journalist. Glenn Greenwald, I think, it'd be harder to do. But there are ways of going after them punitively that don't involve prosecution, like going after their phone records so their sources dry up.
I saw an astounding comment by Pete Williams, who used to be the Pentagon spokesperson, who's now with NBC this morning, he had talked with Attorney General Eric Holder, who'd said when he goes after the reporters, the AP reporters, the Fox reporter, they're not so much going after them, not to worry. They're going after the whistleblowers. They're trying to get through them, the people. What about that? That separation
right.
of these
I'll give
two.
You an example from the AP. They had a reporter named, I believe, John Solomon. In 2000, he reported a story about the botched investigation into Robert Torricelli. The FBI didn't like the fact that he'd written this story about how they dropped the ball on that, so they went after his phone records. And 3 years later, he talked to some of his sources who had not talked to him since then, and they said, we're not going to talk to you because we know they're getting your phone records.
We want to thank you all for being with us. Shana Kadidal of the Center for Constitutional Rights, William Binney and Thomas Drake both worked for the National Security Agency for years and both ultimately resigned. Thomas Drake was prosecuted. They were trying to get him under the Espionage Act. All of those charges were dropped. William Binney held at gunpoint by the FBI in his shower, never prosecuted. Both had expressed deep concern about the surveillance of American citizens by the U.S. government. You can go to our website at democracynow.org for our hours of interviews.